Hello and welcome to another episode of the RevRx Podcast. My name is Chad Potts and I'm your host. Today I'm sitting down with space geologist Ruby Patterson and just having a conversation about outer space. If you've ever wanted to sit down with a space scientist and talk about the moon, Mars, and all the other planets in the solar system, this episode is for you. I grew up fascinated by all of these things, and this conversation was the most fun that I've had in a podcast interview yet. We talk about what a space geologist does. We talk about moon rocks. We talk about landing on the moon. We talk about Mars and all the rest of the planets and how there are plans in place to actually start discovering more and more. There's a lot we don't know about our solar system, but we're going to talk about some of the things we do know and some of the things that we're trying to figure out today. Today is September 13th, on the day that this episode releases, and this is actually the 65th anniversary of the landing of Luna 2 on the moon, which was actually the very first spacecraft to ever make contact with another solar system body. And so I think it's only fitting that we release this episode with Ruby on this day as we commemorate such an important journey to the moon. You see, Ruby is the U.S. lead for research and development at the Iceland Space Agency. She's led research at NASA, looking at some of the mysteries of the moon and Mars and other planets. She's a truly fascinating individual, and you're going to love every minute of this episode. So sit back, relax, get your astronaut hats on, and get ready for a fun conversation with Ruby Patterson. Thank you, Ruby, for joining us today on the RevRx Podcast. What a privilege it is to have you here with us.
Thanks, Chad. I'm really excited to be here, and it's an honor to be on your show.
Yeah. So you are a space geologist, right?
Yes, the rumors are true.
Tell me about that. What does a space geologist do? And what kind of sparked your interest in space exploration, geology, all that?
So a space geologist does everything that a geologist on Earth would do, but it's applied to planetary bodies. And so for those who are not familiar with what geologists do, it's not just oil and gas people. It's not just people that study volcanoes. It's folks that study sediment transport and earthquakes and all sorts of deep time records of crust formation. And so what I do as a space geologist, my specialty is Mars geochemistry and lunar geology. And so I have a history of acting in both of those realms, which has been a really cool, rewarding experience. But the way that I found out about this career path was completely by accident. I actually went to a conference when I was still at a community college. Like I won some competition for community college students to go to this conference in Washington, D.C. And it was a geology conference. And I walked past this table that had this giant blow up moon, like a beach ball almost. And I was like, hold up, what's that? That looks really cool. And I went over to the table and I started talking to a woman there. And I asked her so many nerdy questions, like, wait a minute. So you can be a geologist, but study rocks on the moon? Like, why would we even want to study rocks on the moon? How do you study rocks on the moon? Or can you do this for other planets? And it turns out that literally almost every single natural process that occurs on Earth with respect to the lithosphere, or like our crust, actually happens on other planets, just with different temperature and pressure and chemical regimes. So it's actually a very interesting, unusual career path. And I'm happy that I stopped by that table because that woman ended up being my mentor and really taking me under her wing. I was just annoying enough and just persistent enough that she was like, Ruby, you should probably consider a career in this. And so eventually, like a year or two later, she ended up hiring me to be her lab assistant and taught me everything she knew. But I started out washing dishes in her lab for hours and hours and hours because I wasn't trained enough. I wasn't cool enough to play with the big dogs yet. And so I had to work my way up from there.
Yeah, you had to put in your time, I guess, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. In kind of a chance meeting, right? Wasn't expecting to, what hasn't always been your dream to study rocks in outer space. But, it's kind of like when you know, right? It sparked the interest in you at that moment, and the rest is history. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. Now that you're no longer washing dishes in a lab, you're getting to play with the big dogs. Tell us a little bit about what that looks like for you, kind of just big picture, then even on a daily basis.
Sure. So big picture, my newly minted title, which sounds actually really cool, and I'm very proud of this title, is the United States Lead of Research and Development for the Iceland Space Agency. And so what I do in this role... I
didn't want to mess that up, so I'm glad you said that.
Hey, if you messed it up, I wouldn't tell anyone. But what I do, so I live in Southern California, and there's so many space startups out here that want to send stuff to Mars or to asteroids or to the moon, that they need someone to really guide them in field testing on Earth to make sure that all of their hardware and all of their sensor packages or rover wheels or spacesuits or whatever they're developing are battle hardened and ready for the space environment. Gotcha. And a lot of these startups are also really bootstrapping. Like, they don't have a $1 kajillion to hire this dream team of people. They're doing the best they can with what they got. And so what I do is I will step in and sometimes act in a consultant type role, because they don't want to pay a geologist full time on their staff. So they'll hire me kind of as needed, so I can step in as a consultant. But I also have a lot of field experience, especially in Iceland. And so I will help design field plans for them and help facilitate special permitting. And in some cases, I will actually go to Iceland with them and help them carry out their field expeditions, or recommend people that would be better suited to their specific needs in Iceland, so that they can have the best possible, highest fidelity testing in an environment as close as possible to the lunar environment as we can get on Earth. And Iceland just so happens to be a really good place to do that. And there's other places on Earth that you can go to as well. But Iceland is also a really historic place for space analog testing. All the Apollo astronauts trained out there, and a lot of the Artemis astronauts, or the up and coming astronauts that don't know if they're even selected for the Artemis program yet, they go to Iceland and they do a lot of field training out there. So it's really a great proving ground for space companies to test their technologies.
That's really cool. So what about Iceland makes it ideal for, the similarities between that and the lunar surface? What about the surface in Iceland makes it unique? Iceland
is a predominantly basaltic terrain. And what that means is that it's mostly just volcanic rocks. And I say just, all the geologists listening to this are like, how dare you say just? But and so Iceland is covered with predominantly volcanic basaltic rocks. And this is very, very similar to the rocks that we find on the lunar surface. In addition to this, it's very desolate. You can find vast expanses of nature that you will not run into another person. Also, geochemically, the basaltic rocks in Iceland are very similar to large swaths of the lunar surface. In addition to that as well, there's not typically a lot of transport distance from the source of these rocks, meaning like the volcanic edifice from where they come from, to where they eventually stop and land and sink and become a different type of rock later on. I'm like getting into the rock cycle now, but this is very similar to the lunar surface, because on the moon, there's no atmosphere, there's no wind, there's no rain to erode and weather and shape and round these grains to act more like beach sand. They actually act very much like sticky, pointy, like miniature needles. And so a lot of the sediments, a lot of the volcanic sediments and volcanic rocks in Iceland behave similar to the rocks on the moon.
Okay. So on your Instagram, I love your hashtags. It's like women in space and different things like that. But one of the things you put on there was actually samples of lunar rock. And, I think they were in bags and that kind of thing. So, how does that happen? I think you said that we picked some of that up with meteorite remains or something like that. But can you talk a little bit about how we're able to obtain these samples from the moon?
Yes, absolutely. So there's two major ways that we can get rocks from the moon. So the first way you already mentioned, and that's they get delivered to Earth for free in the form of meteorites that big teams of scientists will go and collect from Antarctica. And there's actually major Antarctic meteorite hunting expeditions that happen almost every single year in Antarctica. And so that's definitely, like, if you've ever seen what's the Nicolas Cage movie where he wants to steal the Declaration of Independence? National Treasure.
Yep.
You know the scene where they're like on ski-doos, like on a glacier and like whatever. It's actually like that.
Cool.
So maybe it was National Treasure too when they do that. But anyway, there's actually teams of scientists that mob around on snowmobiles down on Antarctica, and they hunt for meteorites. And so they bring them back to America in this very special lab at Johnson Space Center, where they curate and catalog and prepare all of these meteorites for scientific analysis. And so they're not just lunar meteorites that they find down there. It's also Martian meteorites and meteorites from all different types of asteroids. So that's one way that we get lunar rocks. And the other way is the very expensive but very fancy and my favorite method of getting lunar rocks, which is we go to the moon and we pick them up ourselves.
Yep.
And so the only time America has done this was in the Apollo program.
Okay.
And that means that we physically sent a bunch of men to the moon, like from 1969 all the way through the late 70s, and they bagged and sampled sediments and boulders and cobbles and everything in between, and they brought it back to Earth for us to analyze. And so when I was working as a Mars geochemist at NASA Johnson Space Center, my office just so happened to be down the hallway and one elevator ride away from this high security laboratory facility where they house all of the moon rocks that have ever been collected by Apollo astronauts.
That's so cool.
It also just so happened, it is so cool. I felt really lucky when I got to go in there the first time. And then I befriended, and now she's one of my best friends in the whole world, a woman named Hannah O'Brien, who is an incredibly talented lunar scientist, but she's one of the curators in that lab. And now we're besties. And so whenever I want to go in there, I'm like, hey, hey, Hannah, can I just hop over and see what you guys have been working on? And so she has been able to give me basically presidential tours to me and some of my friends of that lab. So I have no real professional reason for being in there other than just professional curiosity and getting very well acquainted with the types of rocks that I study.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you go into this lab, it's actually really fun because you have to dress up in what's called a bunny suit. So you cover yourself from head to toe. You wear booties, a big Oompa Loompa onesie that's white. You have to put a hood over, or a big shower cap over your head. And you have to take off all your jewelry, especially no gold jewelry, because that's really easy to contaminate rocks with gold. And you have to take an air shower. And so there's this kind of funny, awkward experience. Sometimes if you're on a tour you're in there with someone you don't know very well, you get to know them pretty well very quickly because you're standing in this really cramped shower stall where this laminar flow of air sweeps over your head and down your body. And the whole purpose of that is to remove any sort of dust particulates from you so that you don't carry that into the lab. And once you're in the lab, you'll notice that there's tons of glove boxes. So imagine giant terrariums basically with holes cut in them with giant, I'm trying to explain this the best I can, but giant kitchen gloves that are made of a special material. And the gloves are inside of the box with the holes on the outside. So you can just push your hands into them. And so you never actually touch the lunar rocks with one single pair of gloves, and you never touch them with your bare hands. You never breathe on them with your regular breath. They're always highly protected and kept in the most pristine condition possible. Wow. And something that's very cool about the Apollo sample return program is that when they were designing how they were going to study all of these moon rocks, they decided, okay, we have the cutting edge technology of the 1970s, but we're anticipating in the coming 50 years that technology is going to evolve so much that we're actually going to cut every single sample in half, and we're going to zip up half of every sample, and we're going to lock it away in a giant vault that requires at minimum 2 people at one time to open.
Wow.
And we're going to just put it away for safekeeping. And they recently unzipped those other halves of some of the samples a couple of years ago, because on the 50-year anniversary of the Apollo landings. And they thought, what a great way to commemorate it. Let's unzip some of these samples and try to learn some new things. And so people are often really surprised to realize that even though we've had these samples for decades now, we're still learning new things about them literally every single day.
Wow. Yeah, and that's what's cool about it is that they've explored 50 plus years ago, and we still have evidence of that today. We're still playing with rocks, you could say, even still today. So thinking about, all right, there were those missions to the moon. And, of course, some of those weren't successful. We know all the stories and everything, but you're starting to see some private companies wanting to make their mark in history and be able to transport people to the moon and that sort of thing. Just as someone who understands space a whole lot more than the average person, what are your thoughts on that? In my mind, I'm thinking, okay, that's pretty dangerous, but curious to know what your thoughts are, particularly from a scientific method of looking at that, the disruption of the surfaces and that sort of thing.
Wow, that is a really great question. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because a lot of people don't realize how it's a bit of a tug in both directions as a scientist who's now working in industry. So a lot of times I do have to walk this knife's edge of being a classically trained scientist, where I want to preserve the immaculate pristinity of the lunar surface, because it quite literally is this cosmic library that's just waiting to be tapped for information. But then now, as I'm working in industry and I'm literally helping facilitate people go to the moon and disrupt this beautiful geologic environment with untold answers to questions we've been trying to answer for thousands of years, it's this ethical quandary that I wrestle with, honestly, quite often. And so one example of this that I'll share is, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard of SpaceX, this rocket company that Elon Musk has started, and it's doing incredible things for the space industry. But most notably, they've won a contract from NASA to launch tons and tons of cargo, or as we call it, payload, to the lunar surface inside of a rocket called a Starship. And the Starship is going to be, I think, about 70 meters tall. So it's a giant rocket. And if any of your listeners watched the Olympics in Paris this past summer and you saw the swimmers swimming in the giant pool, that pool is 50 meters long. So this rocket is actually going to be 20 meters longer than the Olympic swimming pool was long. And when you think about the amount of payload and mass that can be cramped into the Starship, and you have to think about how much reverse force is going to be required to safely land this giant rocket delicately on the lunar surface, you're going to be disrupting an insane amount of lunar regolith. You're going to be disrupting tons, literally tons, of this unconsolidated lunar soil, or regolith as we call it, from in and around the landing site area. And there's been a lot of modeling work done by a gentleman named Phil Metzger from Florida, and he's modeled the effects, the plume effects of landing a Starship on the lunar surface, and what that actually might do to the lofting of the regolith as the Starship descends. And what one Starship will do is actually create a transient lunar atmosphere that encapsulates the entire moon. And so even landing one Starship will affect literally every single place on the moon. And so on one hand, I'm like, oh, I'm a scientist. This really breaks my heart. Like, we really have to get up there and sample as much as we can before Starship kind of gets up there and effectively ruins it. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but in a way, they kind of are ruining it for a lot of scientists. But then the other side of me is like, let's do this thing. Like, I'm so ready. I want to go to the moon. I know you want to go to the moon. Let's all go together. Let's hop in a Starship and go. And so it's a hard mental balance to strike, because I see both sides of it very clearly.
Yeah, it seems like you're right in the middle of that. And I think that's a really brilliant way to look at it, is that you're kind of torn in both directions. Is there value in it? Yes. Is there also lots of untold answers that we're seeking in the territory that is undisrupted? Absolutely. And that's amazing that one Starship would kind of affect the entire moon. That was going to be my next question, was, what are the models showing that the effects of that would be? And that's incredible.
Yeah, and something else that's worth mentioning is that a lot of the lunar regolith is extremely, extremely fine-grained, like to the point where if you're familiar with like makeup setting powder, or almost like talcum powder granularity or like grain size, that's what most of the lunar surface is like. I mean, it's basically miniature glass needles of that size range. And so it's very, very sticky. It gets stuck in like all of the astronaut spacesuits. It abrades all of the astronaut visors to the point where they're like scratched and they have a hard time seeing within a specific angle to the sun, which kind of has the same effect of like driving in a separate direction as someone with their headlights on when it's foggy outside. It kind of like occludes your vision a little bit. It ruins camera lenses. It does all sorts of things. And also, because it's so fine, it has a really, really hard time settling. And so when we loft it up and create this transient atmosphere, it's going to create a pretty hazy surface environment. And we don't really know how to mitigate that effectively, especially on like a global, like a lunar global scale.
Sure. Yeah. There's so much we don't know.
Yeah.
So thinking about, okay, when's the last time that man was on the moon?
The late 70s.
Yeah. And so, with all our technology today, we haven't been back in a 50-ish, 45 years. Why is that? I know we saved half of what they brought back. So is it because we're still kind of working on that? Is it that fear of disrupting, the surface? What has kind of kept us from traveling to the moon for the last, for as long as I've been alive?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of different reasons. So I think the initial space race when we went to the moon in the 70s was because we wanted to beat Russia there. And we succeeded in that. And that was like the big driving force behind that. And so that was a really, really big, glorious era for NASA. And so after that, after we got all these rocks and these astronauts back, we're like, hey, we're good. Like we can focus on maybe another planetary body now. And so also there's this element of every 4 years, our administration changes in America, or 4 to 8 years, the administration changes, and every president has a different idea of what should or should not be done with respect to space exploration. So not only does the NASA budget fluctuate every 4 to 8 years, we also have this element of programmatic balance. Like people in the planetary science community who don't study the moon are like, hey, NASA, what about Mars? What about Venus? And so they get really vocal and they lobby to Congress and they lobby to our government and they say, we want more funding to go to other planets and study them because they're worthwhile for other reasons. So after the moon, there was a very big push for gearing up to go study Mars. And so there was the launch of a whole succession of flybys and orbiters and landers and then rovers. And then we had an attempt at drilling on Mars through the InSight lander. And that was ultimately not as successful. They had a probe that it was supposed to be a heat probe that ultimately failed because the geotechnical properties of the Martian regolith were a little bit harder to get through than they expected. But that's par for the course. They still, managed to get a lot of good data from that mission. But to answer your question, we haven't been back because we've been busy changing administrations and focusing on other planets and sending things out to Pluto with New Horizons and doing flybys of Mercury with Bepi Colombo. And most notably, most recently, NASA announced that our next big flagship, like Discovery class mission is actually going to be out to Uranus, which is like the most understudied planet ever. And I can't wait for all of the memes to come out about these missions.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And that's really, really insightful. And it's something I haven't really thought about was, as far as government funding for NASA, the fact that it will fluctuate and the priorities will change based on lobbyists, based on Congress, which changes, and then based on the administration. So really good insight there to kind of help us to see, all right, well, it's not that easy to just say, hey, we're going to go to the moon tomorrow.
And even beyond like going to a planet, like we've launched the James Webb Space Telescope and we've done, all these other types of, deep space surveys that are also taking a lot of funding and focus from hard boots on the ground, landing on an actual planetary surface type of work.
And I think it shows us that science is more than just the big splash, right? Of course, walking on the moon, that sounds so much cooler to other people than a lot of the things that are going on behind the scenes. But true science, you only get those splashes every now and then. True science is trying to answer those unanswered questions. So that kind of leads me to what questions is space geology trying to answer, if that makes sense?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I'm going to do my best to keep this under a 2-hour answer. No.
Yeah.
So it just depends on what planetary body that you're on. So, for example, I'll stick with the moon for now, and we can move to Mars in a minute. But on the moon, because there's no atmosphere, there's no plate tectonics, there's no wind, there's no rain, there's none of these elements that we have on Earth that effectively erase and recycle all of our crust. The history of the moon, since it was created, is completely preserved in place. Yeah. From when it originally formed. Like there's no plate tectonic shifting to move things around, that we have to do this like paleotectonic reconstruction. Like we don't have that on the Earth. And so we have impact craters that are preserved. We have all sorts of geochemical signatures. We have solar wind implantation that's preserved in the lunar regolith. And all of these things have hints and clues that we can use to reconstruct what our early solar system was like. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is just knowing about lunar resources. Like we want to go further into our solar system, but it's so expensive. And a lot of times like payload or the cargo that you're carrying is one of the limiting factors, because you don't want to carry a bunch of water with you to the moon because it's so incredibly heavy, and it costs, I don't know how many tens of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, depending on who launches your payloads to the moon, that would cost. And so we want to be able to effectively like mine that and process that in situ or in place on the lunar surface. And so we want to know all about what types of resources that we can leverage on the moon, so that we don't have to take care of that on Earth and pay to ship it up there, or we don't have to mine that on Earth and continue to degrade our spaceship Earth, if you will. And so then there's other questions about our solar system that can be answered on planets like Mars or a moon called Titan. Like Mars is believed to may have at one point, maybe possibly, harbored life. And so that's one of the really big pushes or behind the Curiosity rover science team, and especially the Perseverance rover science team. They're looking for biosignatures in places that are most likely to have harbored life on Mars. And it's like finding a needle in a haystack. Like you think, oh yeah, these science whizzes at NASA, if anyone can do it, they can. And of course, that's true. Like there's a lot of very talented people at NASA, but you think about the terrain, like the spatial extent of how much you're actually studying with a rover versus the total spatial extent of the planet Mars. And it's like, wow, we're just a drop in the bucket. Like I really hope we can do it, but man, it's a tough thing to tackle for sure.
Sure. So what are some upcoming missions? You'd mentioned one or two already, but what are some upcoming missions and research that you're most excited about in the field of space?
Ooh, okay. So there's one mission that I'm very partial to. It's called the Viper mission, and it stands for Volatiles Investigating Polar Exploration Robot. I hope I got that right. But basically, this was a rover that cost about $500 million that NASA built and tested, and it had all these fancy whoosy whatsits on it that can essentially characterize the lunar surface environment and sniff out any sort of water vapor and just basically give us really good geochemical information about what sort of resources we might encounter in the lunar South Pole region. Now, the Viper rover got a lot of press recently because it was actually canceled. The entire mission was canceled. And this had the planetary community up in flames, Chad. We were real upset. And people are still lobbying and trying to get it reinstated because people's entire careers are on the line. Like people have been dedicating 10 years to this, and all of a sudden NASA's like, oops, sorry, we're over budget. So we're going to cancel this $500 million rover mission to save like $80 million, right? So the math ain't mathin', in my opinion, but NASA can do what they want to do. So what I'm excited about with respect to this mission is that the commercial space community sees the value in the Viper rover and all of the instruments on board. And there's now this coalition of commercial space companies led by a company called Intuitive Machines out of Houston, Texas, that are now trying to buy the Viper rover so that they can independently send it to the moon and use all of the fancy whoosy whatsits on board to fund or to further their scientific exploits. And so
Love
I'm
it.
very excited to see this play out for several reasons. Number one, like the business reason, like what is this going to do to the reputation of intuitive machines, the stock price of intuitive machines, because they're publicly traded? What's this going to do to the other companies that are involved in this? Hopefully, presumably, it's going to support and help nourish their business development.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
also, I'm really interested in like what's going on in the rocks up there. Like
Yeah.
we've never actually explored the lunar South Pole at all. And the geology of the lunar South Pole region is vastly different than the geology where we sent the Apollo astronauts. And so one of the major differences is that it's actually the oldest and most primordial crust that's preserved on the moon. So we're going to get clues about the very, very beginning of when the moon was just starting to crystallize from
Wow.
a basically burning ball of magma in space. And we don't have any evidence of that in our Apollo collection. We have maybe like a fragment of a rock. We have like a clast inside of another rock. But we need more information about what that early moon formation time was like. And
Sure.
something else that people really do not understand about the lunar South Pole region is how absolutely treacherous the topography is. And so something that I like to highlight when I tell people about this is that there's essentially a Mount Everest situation in the lunar South Pole. Like if you
Wow.
think of Mount Everest on Earth and how many people have tried and failed and tried and succeeded to summit it, and how much of an incredible accomplishment that is, there's actually this place on the moon that if you go from the rim of Shackleton Crater to the top of a feature called Malapert Massif, there is actually a greater elevation gain on the moon than there is over the same distance on Earth from the base of Mount Everest to the top of Mount Everest. And so when we're talking about going to the lunar South Pole, this is no small feat. Like not only is the topography absolutely insane, we have incredible temperature fluctuations between shadowy regions and regions that are lit by sunlight. Something else that a lot of people don't realize about the moon is that there's areas of permanently shadowed craters, like areas that literally never receive a single drop of sunlight. And these regions can be actually colder than the surface of Pluto. And that's just on our moon.
Yeah.
And this is such a mind trip when you're trying to create spacesuits or any sort of scientific instrument, because you have to design this hardware to withstand temperatures that range from Pluto to like sunlight on the moon. And that's a very, very hard material science challenge to overcome. So good luck to them, whoever's designing those things.
Sure. Lots of exciting things to come. Yeah, this has been fun, Ruby. Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Appreciate what you're doing. And it's just neat to be able to talk about what we do know as a very small percentage of what we may know down the road. So appreciate you being here. Thanks, Ruby. Thank you for listening to the RevRx Podcast. We hope you enjoyed what you heard today, and if so, we'd love it if you would hit that subscribe button so that you'll never miss a new episode from us. Also, feel free to leave us reviews and comments, as we'd love to hear from you. Be blessed and be the very best you.